You're live on News at Prime. Thanks for staying with us tonight. One of the concerns in the midst of this looting, of course, is the long-term impact, and perhaps more immediately is the impact when it comes to supply chain. We heard the president last night referencing concerns over food and medical supply shortages. Let's take you to Christo van der Rheede. He is with AgriSA, and of course they've been watching this situation closely. Christo, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. From the position of AgriSouth Africa, speak to me about where things stand right now and how seriously South Africans should be about potential food security issues.
It's important to divide the conversation into two parts. One, local supply, food supplies, and then obviously food that we export to the rest of the world. Now, in terms of local food supplies, I think in most provinces we do not have a problem. But in KZN, we've had large-scale looting and destruction of shops, and we've seen blockading of roads. Big concern for us is obviously the N3, which is a leading road, and it's blocked in both directions. So this will lead to food shortages in KZN. We've also seen images of the public queuing for food supplies at the few shops that are still in operation. And I think this is an issue that we need to address. It's something that we cannot afford to spill over to other provinces. Otherwise, we're going to have a serious problem in terms of short-term food supplies in terms of the country.
Sure, go ahead.
But in terms of exports, we've seen the Durban Harbour closing down. Remember, we're also in the midst of our citrus harvesting season, and citrus is now being packaged and sent via trucks to Durban Harbour to be exported, and most of our citrus farms have halted their operations because they are not prepared to send trucks down to Durban, and at the end of the day it gets vandalized.
How long can the sector afford this situation? So is there a point where it becomes difficult to make up for the lost time?
Especially in your citrus fruit sector, that citrus, when it's harvested, it must be boxed and loaded onto trucks. It must get into the harbour via the cold chain and onto the boats, and it must be shipped overseas. Now, our biggest challenge there is, remember, we have orders to fulfill, and our buyers in overseas countries are not going to wait for us. They will rather than source from other countries such as Spain, and we're going to lose market share. So that is a very big concern to us, and farmers and the farming sector stand to lose billions in terms of exports. And so is the country in terms of foreign exchange.
Christo, I'm going to ask you just to hang 10 for me. We're going to continue our conversation with you my conversation with the AgriSA's Executive Director, Christo van der Rheede, who has been telling us about the concerns that the sector has in as far as the ability to meet some of the supply chain demands that are expected of them. Christo, let me just come back to you then and continue our conversation with you tonight. So you've expressed the concerns about the international market and the ability to fulfill some of the orders. Talk to me about locally. Are there hotspots that you are watching? Are there areas that you are concerned may be hit by potential supply shortages? And which are those areas? The reason I ask this question, Christo, is that we've seen people then start to panic buy in different parts of the country because they're afraid that goods will be unable to move from KZN to the rest of the country.
That's the biggest problem, to move goods, and we've also seen a possible supply in fuel, and that for us is a very, very big concern. Most of our farms are in operation in all of the other provinces. Farmers in KZN have a big battle on their hands because some of the sugarcane fields were set alight. We've also seen major destruction of infrastructure on some farms, and we've seen cattle and other livestock being stolen. Now, that cannot continue like that because it will have a major impact on our ability as a sector to supply food to not only KZN but to the rest of the country. Our logistical network, especially our roads, our harbors, our markets, as well as other infrastructure, needs to be protected at all costs, because the food supply is not a problem. It is our ability to deliver food on the doorstep of people. And there's no use you have a shop that once sold food to communities that can no longer do so because it's completely destroyed. And that will become a big problem going into the future when shops get destroyed left, right, and center, and we do not have a point where we can supply food to communities.
That's a very important point that you're making, Christo, and I imagine it's one of those that you'll have to wait perhaps a couple of weeks before you're fully able to say what the changes in supply and demand have been, especially for shops and stores that you supply with goods.
Indeed, it will obviously, it's very difficult to make an assessment at this point in time. Your big retailers such as ShopRite and Woolworths and so forth and Spar will be able to give us a good indication of the losses that they have experienced and the impact that this has had on the infrastructure. But remember, there's another element here. Many of our NGOs and churches and other soup kitchens, they depend on a regular food supply in order to make commitments towards the poorest of the poor. And what is going to happen at schools? Remember, many of our kids are dependent on that 1 meal a day that they receive. If there's no food coming through the supply chain where NGOs, churches, and the school system can access it, then we're going to see major hunger in many communities and even starvation. And this is absolutely critical that we keep an eye on this. Otherwise, it can fuel even more social instability when people go hungry.
Christo, earlier on in the morning, and it was before the briefing that was held by the Ministers of Justice and Crime Prevention Cluster, there was a statement that was that had been made attributed to AgriSA, calling for a state of emergency. You've had an opportunity to hear what the ministers are saying in as far as security is concerned. Do you think that you would still want to see a state of emergency declared?
Obviously, if the situation escalates and it becomes a national crisis, then we will have no option but to implement a national state of emergency. But I would agree. For now, I think we can apply the current disaster regulations and we need to get much more manpower, because there's no use you have a state of emergency and you cannot effectively implement it. So manpower is of critical importance. I don't think the 2,500 soldiers are enough. And I'm not saying here that people must now go on a shooting spree. That's something that we don't want. But we need the police, together with the army, together with other security agencies, together with private security, to come together so that we form some kind of barrier against these criminals that are on a looting spree. And the big problem that we're going to face now is where communities are starting to mobilize, because it's not only the shops in the communities that are under threat or infrastructure, but criminals are now even coming for you in your home. So certainly this is something that we will have to keep an eye on.
AgriSA Executive Director Christo van der Rheede, let me thank you so much for your time on News at Prime tonight. So